Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the seven churches of the book of Revelation in our continuing study of New Testament backgrounds. Notice we have Greece and Asia Minor on the right, and we're going to focus our attention on an island off the coast of Asia Minor. Let's zoom in a little closer, and you can see the island of Patmos, where our story begins in Revelation chapter 1. Google Maps gives us a bird's eye view, actually a space eye view. You can see the contour of this island of Patmos. It's twisted and turned with all sorts of inlets and natural harbors, a very rocky island. As we come up to the island itself, you can see the various rock formations. There's greenery, yes, but the first thing that impresses you is all the rocks. As we land on the island, we'll go to the south section. It is from here that we get an overview. Actually, I'm taking this picture with my back to a monastery that has been placed there in commemoration of John and the vision that he had on the island of Patmos. Some people have thought that this was a prison island. It was not, to the best of our knowledge, but it may be that John was banished here. That you wouldn't be banished to a prison island, you would be banished to some out of the way place, so it wouldn't kill you, but it would get you out from public view. And it was just a way to get rid of you without putting you to death. Notice if you look in the distance, you can see another island. You can look in almost any direction and see other islands of what are called the Cyclades, these islands that dot the Aegean. It's while John is on Patmos that he receives a revelation and a message from Jesus himself, who tells him to write seven letters to seven churches. Now, these churches, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, notice you're making a long circuitous route, so that the letters are actually given in that order, in a geographical order, as you follow the route that you would make to reach each one of those churches. We're going to look at six of those seven. I've never been to Thyatira, so I really can't make too many comments about the church that's located there. We'll start in Ephesus, and the first thing you notice in this picture is showing you where the ancient shoreline is. The modern shoreline has moved far out, several miles out toward the Aegean. Looking at the same picture, you can see the modern shoreline in the distance. You can see the Aegean Sea, and that long flat plain is created by all the sediments that the river has deposited over 2,000 years, that has moved that harbor far out, miles outward. The inscription here, Mount Ephesus, reminds us that Ephesus itself was placed between two large hills. Now that you're looking at the terrain, the way it looks today, this is a model, not an actual aerial view. Um, but in Paul's day, if you go to the New Testament era, that sea was much closer. There was a harbor. Even back then, they used to have a problem with the harbor silting up, and they had to do their own dredging back then. Eventually, that stopped, and the sea moved quite a bit out to the west. Notice that the city lies between these two hills, and that was very fortuitous because previously the inhabitants of the area had lived in the marshy plains to the north, and they were always getting sick with malaria. Now, they didn't know that mosquitoes carried malaria. They didn't have that level of medical expertise, but they did notice that the people that moved into this area between those two hills, there was always a wind flow that would sort of push the mosquitoes out of the area. I've been to Ephesus a number of times. Each time I've been there, I've always felt the wind blowing quite strongly down through these hills. It's like an automated ventilation that's caused by these two hills. Here's a model. Now, the model here is actually at Ephesus. And again, you can see the two hills, one that would be our vantage point, and you can see the valley. Notice On the upper left-hand side of our picture, you have the theater. We're going to come and get a closer look at that. And the city itself sort of wraps around this area. Now, there were other areas of the city too. It had outspread this area, so you could go to our left, and you would see a hippodrome that is a big horse racing arena, or chariot races, as the case may be. Let's begin with an odium. An odium is sort of like a miniature theater, but it's really designed for group meetings, not a theater where the theater is going to be much bigger than this. And you get to see just a bit of the architecture from this area. Here are the public baths, as well as the main road taking you down in the direction eventually toward the theater. In the distance, you can see a two, maybe three-story building. That's the Library of Celsus. We'll get closer to it in just a moment. But on our way there, notice the mosaics on the sidewalk uh, as we're walking through the wealthy part of town. Each one of those is hand carved and placed there to make all sorts of beautiful ornamentation. Yes, they have faded a bit over 2,000 years. You would fade too if somebody left you out in the sun for 2,000 years, but you can see the beauty of this area. You can also get sort of a glimpse of the riches of the area too. As I said, we're walking through the wealthier part of town right now. We come to the public toilets uh, for a brief respite. You find these in quite a number of cities, so seeing them in Ephesus is no surprise. And now we come to the Library of Celsus. As I said, this library had not yet been built. There were some other libraries in Asia Minor. In fact, we're going to look in a minute at Pergamum. There was a great library at Pergamum. Celsus he was antagonistic toward Christianity, so this library is built and named for him. Inside the library, on one of the stones, you can see carved a image of a menorah, which tells us that there was a Jewish presence in Ephesus, as there was in each one of the cities to which we're going to come. Out on the street, you see another carving. In this case, it is notice there's no words to this one. This was meant for the sailors coming off of their ships, and they might see there a foot with it's telling you go this way. Notice the little image of a woman to the right, and the upper left, there is a heart. If you want to find love, go to this section, go in this direction for a price. I'm not sure what the price was, but it was soliciting the attentions of the sailors looking for some fun in Ephesus. Now, we read in Acts chapter 19 that there was a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made shrines of Artemis, bringing no little business to the craftsmen. And one thing we find a great many of in Ephesus are these shrines, these statues, these idols of Artemis. She looks sort of strange, almost deformed. That's because she is showing great fertility. Notice all the multitude of breasts that are stemming from her. There was a temple to Artemis that was located in Ephesus. It was considered one of the wonders of the world. It was considered, I think it's been measured at being maybe 3 or 4 times the size of the Parthenon in Athens. And if you were allowed to go to the front of the temple, notice you can see this is the model. You can see into the temple. At the very back would be the very holy place. We might call that the Holy of Holies. And there would be this great grand statue of Artemis herself. We have found all sorts of relics, all sorts of statues. Maybe some of them were made by Demetrius himself. Some of them are life-size, some of them are much smaller, and they were used for the worship of this goddess. Now, Demetrius complained that Christianity was growing at such a rate that he says not only is there danger that this trade of ours fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the world worship should even be dethroned from her magnificence. What you are looking at, and notice there's a column in the distance, not too far in the distance, but then there's just several stones piled up in front of it. And that's all that is left today of the Temple of Artemis. It has indeed been regarded as worthless, and she has been dethroned from her magnificence. Indeed, if you want to see the temples of the columns of the temple, you have to go to modern day Istanbul, go into the Hagia Sophia, and there you will see the columns that were removed from Ephesus and taken up there in order to build a grand basilica that is a great church to the glory of God. And so here we come to finally to the theater at Ephesus. Here we look at our model again, and you can see from the harbor there was a way that led right up to the theater. And it was here that a great crowd, a mob gathered, yelling for 2 hours. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. The Apostle Paul heard that the mob had gathered, and he said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Let me go speak to them. I can tell them all about Jesus." And his friends stopped him from going there. They said, "No, you'll be pulled apart by the mob." And Paul instead was hustled out of the city, thinking that perhaps he might be put to death, and perhaps he missed his opportunity for a martyrdom in that case, living to tell more of the story of the gospel in other places. Imagine as we leave Ephesus, this entire theater being filled with people screaming out in their paganism. And yet Christianity would come to the city and it would grow and develop and sweep over, eventually, over all of Asia Minor. Now we move from Ephesus northward to Smyrna. Smyrna is a city today. Ephesus, you go to Ephesus and you're only seeing ruins. When you go to Smyrna, nowadays it is known as Izmir, which sounds a little bit like Smyrna, with an I on the front of it, I suppose. It's a major city today. We do find a few ruins there going back to the New Testament era. But of much more importance to us, we will leave the ruins to go into the Church of Polycarp, a church that I'm sure has been through a number of repairs and things like that, but it's still an operating church today, named after Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, who was martyred around 155 AD. From Smyrna, we're going to go north to Pergamum. Now, in Pergamum, there's a city below, but we're going to spend most of our time up on the Acropolis, the height that overlooks the city. Here we'll look at an aerial view. I did not take this particular picture. I didn't fly over, so I borrowed this picture. It's not mine. But notice you can see the theater cut into the side of the mountain. And then up above the theater, you're going to see the various temple complexes, as well as the great library of Pergamum, a library that rivaled that of Alexandria in Egypt. Here's a model of the same area. Now you can't really, you can see where the theater is, but it's hard to make out the details. Like I said, up above the theater would be the library and colonnades and temples all throughout. We'll look at just a few of these. Here's the theater. From this picture, it does not look that the theater is particularly steep. Let me swing around to the other side. My first impression of the theater was that it was the steepest theater I have ever seen, and I've seen quite a number of theaters throughout the ancient world. This one cut into the side of the mountain, and following the slope of the mountain, I thought, oh my goodness, if somebody tripped, they would just go tumbling all the way down. And I was very careful to keep my footing. And so let's walk through those back halls, of course, past the library, and come to an area where once stood was the Temple of Zeus. Now, the temple's not there anymore because it has been taken apart brick by brick and moved to Europe, specifically to Germany. And it was reassembled in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. Let's look at a picture of this vast temple, the way it would have looked standing there in Pergamum. When John writes, and of course it's Jesus who's dictating the words of John, he says, "And to the angel of the church of Pergamum, write the one who has the sharp two-edged sword," he says this. Verse 13, "I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is." Was this Was this what was being described as Satan's throne? Notice he says, "And you hold fast my name and did not deny my faith, even to the day in the days of Antipas, my witness." That's not Herod Antipas. This is somebody who was a Christian. "My faithful one who was killed among you, where Satan dwells." And so, was this the place that is being referenced here? There were a number of pagan temples. It could have been this one. It could have been some of the others that are being referenced, or maybe all of them collectively. From Pergamum, we're going to move past Thyatira down to Sardis. Now, Sardis was the ancient capital of King Croesus, the king of Lydia, who had reigned back in the days right after Nebuchadnezzar, the days of the early Persian Empire. And as you look to that top mountain area, you can see a little bit of construction up there. That was the fortress, the place that you would run to if the city was under attack, and it was considered to be impregnable. And it was to here that Cyrus the Great attacked. He came and surrounded the city of Sardis, and King Croesus, renowned for being the richest man in the world, just took all of his riches and he retreated up there to the fortress. All was considered to be good. Cyrus, after all, couldn't besiege the city for too long because they had plenty of supplies, plenty of water, plenty of everything that they need up on top of the fortress. And so Cyrus the Great was rather stumped. He was the king of the new Persian Empire. Um, and he was looking up at the fortress, and things were sort of boring. One of the soldiers, supposedly, up on the fortress, things were so boring that he fell asleep. And when you start to nod off, your head sort of falls over. And the soldier did this, and his helmet fell off and fell all the way down to the greenery below. Well, he was a little bit embarrassed. It's no small thing to lose your helmet. So he looked back and forth. Nobody was looking at him. And so he climbed over the wall and he made his way down that very steep area. You can't see it from here, but there was a path that was cut into the side of the cliff. He got his helmet, he climbed back up and took his place again. And Cyrus was watching this and he said, "Oh my goodness, there's a way up there that you can't see from down here. And if he can climb down and go back, then tonight we can follow the same route." And that night, Cyrus's soldiers followed the same route up, and while everyone was sleeping, they captured Croesus and the fortress, and Sardis now fell to Cyrus the Great. Now, give that entire story because when you read what is written in the book of Revelation, chapter 3, to Sardis, Jesus has this to say. He says to the church at Sardis, this is what I have to say: wake up! Wake up, because spiritually you are falling asleep. And I think perhaps he's giving a play on the past history of the sleepiness of Sardis and how that had led to the overthrow of the city. And their spiritual sleep is going to it puts them in danger of leading to the spiritual overthrow of the church in Sardis. Now, as we look at Sardis, we're going to walk into the gymnasium. In the back, we'll see a big pool that's sort of dried up and filled in, but the gymnasium would be the place where the pagans would gather, and of course, it was a place of exercise, but also it was a place of culture and to celebrate their pagan rituals. What's interesting about the gymnasium is that the wall that you see here, and my friend he was up there taking a picture of the gymnasium. He's actually standing in the Jewish synagogue that shares a retaining wall with the gymnasium. It's built right up against the gymnasium. This is indeed the largest ancient Jewish synagogue ever found anywhere, at least to my knowledge. Here we're looking at the main entrance of the synagogue, and you can see the Aron. That's the place on one side where you would keep a copy of the Hebrew scriptures. And then we're going to leave and go to the other side of the escarpment. Remember, up there is where we had the fortress. And here on this side, we have a pagan temple. And yet, adjoining this temple is a church. Notice you've got the columns, that's the temple. And off to the left, you see that little stone building. That is a very early church. And again, it's built right up against the pagan temple. What's going on there? With a synagogue next to the gymnasium, a church next to the pagan temple, were they saying, we just don't care. We're just going to put our church, our synagogue anywhere? Or I think it's Ray Vanderlyn who likes to suggest, and I think he might have a point here, that maybe what they were saying is that we're going to represent the presence of God even in a place of paganism. We are going to be here as a presence, and we will shine forth with the truth. And I like to think that he's right, that that's exactly what they were doing. From Sardis, we'll move over to Philadelphia. Now, there's not a lot of ruins that we can see at Philadelphia. There's not the Philadelphia that's in the United States, but a city of brotherly love that's named after it. Remember, these are all Greek cities. And notice, to the angel of the church in Philadelphia, write this. And here was a church that there was a small door, and no one was going to shut it, at least for the time. But what I found interesting, you go to Philadelphia, notice he says, I know your deeds. Behold, I have put before you an open door which no one can shut, because you have a little power and have kept my word and have not denied my name. Behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. I will make them come and bow down at your feet and make them know that I have loved you. Some nice things are said to this church at Philadelphia. However, you go to the Church of Philadelphia today, and all you find are the ruins of this basilica. And I asked around, and I was told that in that town, there are no professing Christians. Instead, you can see the Muslim mosque, the minaret from the mosque that is just outside where the church once stood. And it is a church that is now given over to Islam. From Philadelphia, we move now to Laodicea. This will be the last church we'll look at. Let's zoom in on that area, because there are three cities within that valley, that the Lycus River and the Lycus Valley, through which the river runs, hosts these three cities. Notice you have Colossae and Laodicea, and also across on the other side of the valley, Hierapolis. Now, he writes to the angel of the church of Laodicea, and Laodicea, he's got some things where he warns the church. Now, to understand what's going on here, you have to see a little bit of contrast, because, as I said, further up the valley, you have the city of Colossae, the same city that gets a epistle from the Apostle Paul, the epistle to the Colossians. Now, I can't show you any ruins from Colossae because the city has not been excavated. What you are looking at is the mound that covers the ruins of where the city once stood. So let's now go to Laodicea, which has been excavated. We see in the foreground, you can see a theater. Notice in the distance that white cliff that looks like it has snowed. That's not snow. That's from Hierapolis on the other side of the valley. And you have hot springs there, which overflow the springs and have bleached because those hot springs are full of all sorts of chemicals, and they have bleached the edge of the ridge white. It always looks like it has a a shroud of freshly fallen snow. That's not snow. That's the bleach that has bleached the edge of those cliffs into a very stark white. Laodicea, on the other hand, did not have the hot springs. They did not have the nice cool water that flows by Colossae. Instead, they had their water piped in. Notice that we have a hippodrome, horse racing stadium. Laodicea was a wealthy town, and as I said, they had their water piped in. Here's some of the archwork for the aqueduct. Let's back up and see that aqueduct that brings water from across the valley from Hierapolis all the way to Laodicea. And remember that there's mineral water there, so that mineral water is still flowing as it comes into Laodicea. But instead of being hot springs, by the time it gets here, it's no longer hot. It's just sort of lukewarm, and that's going to be used as a picture of the spiritual life of Laodicea. Verse 14, and the angel of the church in Laodicea write, the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God, says this: I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I would that you were cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. As I said, I think he's using maybe some imagery. If we go back to Colossae, in fact, when I took this picture, I just snapped the picture and I heard some rustling behind me. I turned around and there was this brook, this Lycus River. I don't know if it's a stream that flows right past. It was flowing right behind me. I immediately jumped down on my stomach and put my hand into the water, and sure enough, it was icy, icy, icy cold. It was very cold water because it's flowing down from a nearby mountain. On the other hand, I've already mentioned the cliffs at Hierapolis on the other side of the valley, the hot springs there, and they've actually built hotels over the hot springs, and people even today will come if they can stand the heat. I didn't try to do this because it really is hot, but that's bleached the walls of the cliff white with that chemical. But now we turn to Laodicea, where the water is piped in from Hierapolis. They're not getting the cold water from Colossae. They are getting water from Hierapolis, but by the time it gets here, it has turned lukewarm. And it actually comes into a water distribution system. I'm pointing to some of the pipes. Now, these pipes were all originally where you could see them, but the pipes leaked a bit, and over hundreds of years, it built up this sort of rock-looking residue, and it stretches to quite a large height with this pipes, just showing how much mineral water was in the water. And so Jesus says, "I wish you were hot. I even wish you were cold." I'm not sure if he's talking about, cold in the sense of not wanting God's truth, but maybe he's saying, no, I wish you were cold in the sense of being cold and refreshing. You see, when you see cold, uses the metaphor, it can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing, depending upon the context. And how are we supposed to take it here? I'm not entirely sure. But maybe it's not that I wish you were cold and not interested in God's things, but maybe I wish you were cold and refreshing or hot and alive, but instead you're just lukewarm, and it makes me want to spit you out. And so I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were one or the other. And then there would be there would be spiritual life.